You're listening to episode 229 of Mitolife Radio. I'm your host, Matt Blackburn, and today I'm interviewing Kim Lear. For over 12 years, she's been the Director of Education at Greenwave International. She has her master's degree from Stanford University, and she's just a wealth of knowledge about this topic of dirty electricity. I've been looking into this topic for about a decade now, and a lot of the points that she brought up I was unaware of. So I was really impressed with her depth of knowledge and articulation on such a complex topic. So in this show, she breaks down the 4 different types of EMFs, the difference between proper wiring and improper wiring in a building, different measuring devices and their efficacy, common sources of electromagnetic field radiation, the nuances if you are fully off grid or if you have solar panels and inverters installed, how to save money and strategically place your dirty electricity filters where they'll matter the most, even if you only have 2 or 3. She talks about the difference between various light bulbs and the EMFs that they create. This was a really fascinating discussion, and I think you'll enjoy it. So enjoy the show. Here is Kim Lear. All right, we're here with Kim Lear. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Matthew. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, this will be really great. I've been using your product for years and studying dirty electricity for years. And I actually have one of your filters plugged into the end of my power strip here at my computer. And that's a good little trick I've found to not even lose an outlet that way. So it's kind of cool that you guys actually put a plug into the filter. That was very unique.
Yeah, people like that. You don't lose the use of an outlet with that. So it's a popular feature.
Yeah. So how did you get into this whole industry and subject of dirty electricity?
Yeah, it was actually sort of a personal story. So it was back in the early 2000s. And I'll be honest, I had never really heard of EMF at that point. Certainly didn't, know half of what I know now. And my then husband became electrically hypersensitive. And he had chronic fatigue, a number of years before that. And at that time, his then partner and their pet had been diagnosed with Lyme's disease, but all of his tests were inconclusive. And so, speed forward a little bit, and he became he had been kind of chemically sensitive after kind of getting that fatigue episode. And then, over a number of years became electrically hypersensitive. And at the time, we didn't have that term, to attach to it. We just knew that he was experiencing a lot of unusual symptoms, a lot of facial flushing and kind of prickling sensations on his skin and head and headaches. And he felt really convinced pretty early on that it was his kind of exposure to technology, because he was in a line of work where he used technology a lot. He was kind of an early adopter of all of the newest things. So when the first cell phone came out, he had one and all those kinds of things. And he started making the connection himself. And I'll be honest, I was a little skeptical at first because I had never heard of this. And I wanted to make sure that we were, leaving no stone unturned in terms of trying to figure out what was going on. But, over time, we did figure out that for him, it was his exposure to technology. And for him, it seemed to be the wireless signals and dirty electricity that were the most kind of bothersome to his system. And we started meeting other people that were experiencing the same type of thing. And so it just began a journey for us in terms of learning about EMF, learning about the different types of EMF, and what we could do to figure out what our exposures were in our environments and how we could lower those. And so in that process, because for him in particular, dirty electricity was a particular nuisance, is how we kind of got a focus, on dirty electricity mitigation and founded Greenwave at the time. And then it's kind of been a journey since then. And we've found that though our specialty is dirty electricity, or where we got our start, we're really starting to branch out because we get so many questions about the other types of EMF and what people can do about those. So it continues to be a journey for us in terms of kind of peeling back the onion and trying to find more and more ways, to help ourselves and other people lower their exposures.
That's great. Yeah. I watch a lot of the EMF companies that come up and mitigation things I've seen at different health conferences over the years. And it's kind of like the Wild West because you have everything from stickers you slap on your phone to energy emitters, and there's all these different things. And I think a lot of people just get overwhelmed. What I really like about the dirty electricity filters is they're just so simple and they're measurable with a meter where you don't have to, wonder if it's working. You could actually see it, and a lot of people could actually feel it as well, right?
Yeah. And what we found, I know it was certainly true for my husband, and I know a lot of the other people that I know that are electrically hypersensitive, sometimes their own bodies are their best meters. They often have, actual meters to measure their environment, but their body usually tells them, when they're feeling good and when there's something that's increased in their environment that's not so good.
Yeah. Could you go into the different types of EMF, Kim? Because I think that's an interesting subject.
Yeah, absolutely. Because that's one of, I think, the big confusion points, and one of the questions we get most often. I'll get a lot of calls where people say, well, I measured my EMF and it's this much, and I'll have to kind of back up and I'll say, okay, do you know what type of EMF your meter is measuring? And so that starts the whole conversation because people aren't aware that there's lots of different kinds of EMF. And so basically, there are 4 different kinds of what I will call EMF pollution that have become common in homes today. And I distinguish between, because electromagnetic fields have been around since the beginning of time. There are lots of different kinds of electromagnetic fields that exist in nature. Earth's magnetic field, we have, visible light, we have sunlight. There's all kinds of EMFs that exist in nature. And they exist along a continuum, kind of known as the electromagnetic spectrum. And the real difference between, one type of EMF and another is really just the frequency at which they vibrate. And things like Earth's magnetic field are kind of on the low end because they vibrate very slowly. And then you have things like, X-rays and cosmic rays from space and things on the far end, the far right side of that spectrum that vibrate very, very quickly. And then you have everything in between. And so when we refer to EMF pollution, we're referring not to kind of natural made, EMFs or those that exist in nature, but those that are kind of human made or artificial, and especially those that are not in the ionizing portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. The ionizing portion of the spectrum just means that there's enough energy and power in those types of electromagnetic fields that they can actually change atoms into ions. And it's long been known that ionizing forms of radiation, like UV light from sun or X-rays or cosmic rays from space, can be very detrimental to health because they can actually change, the structure of our atoms. But for a long time, it was believed that non-ionizing forms of radiation that don't have quite that much frequency or power, that they weren't necessarily harmful to our health unless they had enough energy and power to kind of heat body tissue. And what's kind of, we're learning, over time now is that actually those non-ionizing forms of radiation can have a lot of health effects. And there's 4 types of non-ionizing radiation that we kind of refer to as EMF pollution, and that have become really common in, our everyday lives these days. And so they are 3 of them are actually related to our use of electricity. And so we have what are known as our 60 hertz electric fields and 60 hertz magnetic fields. And that 60 hertz just refers to the frequency at which they vibrate. And those fields, the electric fields, 60 hertz electric fields are actually related to the voltage component of electricity. So voltage is kind of like water pressure in that it's applied to like wiring in our walls whenever circuits are turned on or circuit breakers are on, or whenever you plug something into a live outlet, voltage is automatically kind of applied to that wiring or that cord. And it's there to help once you turn something on, it's kind of there to help propel, current through a conductor like a wire. But things don't have to be on for voltage to be there. So whenever a circuit is turned on, or a cord is plugged into an outlet, there will be voltage, on that cord, and there will be electric fields then that are radiating off of those cords. And so that's sometimes surprising to people to know that you can have electric fields coming into your environment, and they tend to, spread off of wiring and cords, up to like 4, 6, sometimes, feet or more. And they can be there even when you don't have things on and running. So even when you're sleeping at night and you have all your lights turned off and, not much on, you've got these electric fields that are radiating off of the wiring in your walls and off of any cord that's plugged into an outlet, even if whatever that cord is meant to power isn't actually turned on. And so those are your AC electric fields. We also have 60 hertz AC magnetic fields. And magnetic fields are current driven, meaning anytime, you turn something on and you actually have electrical current that's now running through a wire or some other conductor, you're going to have a magnetic field that is going to radiate off of that conductor, so off of that wire. And so those are your 60 hertz magnetic fields. And we can get into some of these kind of in more detail. There's lots of different things that, when they're on and running, will give off a magnetic field. And most of those things, most appliances or pieces of equipment, when they're on and running that give off a magnetic field, we call that kind of a point source magnetic field. And so the field coming off of a piece of equipment, and the good thing about point sources of magnetic fields is they can be kind of strong if you're standing right next to that piece of equipment. But as you move away, that field actually drops off pretty quickly. And so point source magnetic fields can be easy to avoid, because you can just, if you know what kinds of equipment are going to produce that type of field, you can just be mindful of where you are in relationship to those pieces of equipment and where you position your bed or your favorite chair to sit in, places that you sit, stand, or lie down for long periods of time. You can just make sure to position them so they're not right in kind of the point source magnetic field given off by a piece of equipment. Magnetic fields that are more problematic are, you do have high magnetic fields that'll come off of power distribution lines, especially high tension power lines. And so, for people when they're thinking about places to live or where to buy a house, you don't necessarily, if you have a choice, you don't want to choose that home that's like literally kind of right underneath those high tension power lines, or real close to them, because you will be getting a high magnetic field as well as electric fields. And magnetic fields from power lines, it's hard to do much of anything about them. They're not like electric fields that can be shielded easily. It's one of those situations where you just want to avoid that if you can. And then people often ask, well, if I have, all of this electricity flowing through the wiring in my walls, whenever I turn things on, do I have a lot of magnetic fields coming, off of my wiring? And the answer to that is you shouldn't. If everything is wired properly, then there's the way that a circuit works is it kind of works in a loop. So you have a hot wire that carries electricity, from your breaker panel, out to, let's say, a light. And then you have a neutral wire for that same circuit that will carry all of that electricity that went out and through the light bulb, then back and, back through your electrical panel. And if everything's wired and working properly, then the amount of electricity that's, flowing along the hot wire for a circuit will equal the amount of current flowing, back through your panel on a neutral wire. And when that happens, it means that you still have magnetic fields that are radiating off of each of those conductors, the hot wire and the neutral wire. But if the amount of electricity that's flowing along each is equal to each other, then they basically cancel each other out. So you should not have high magnetic fields coming off of your wiring if everything is done properly. But sometimes there can be certain kinds of wiring errors where there's improper, neutral to neutral connections, where all of a sudden you don't have a balance, of electricity on the hot wire and neutral wire. Maybe you have electricity going out on the hot wire to a lamp, but maybe there's been an improper connection, and now you have more than one path for that electricity to travel back to your breaker panel. So rather than going back on the one route that it should go back on, which is the neutral wire for that circuit, maybe there's an improper neutral to ground connection. Some of that current's actually returning, trying to get back to the breaker panel versus a metal water pipe. Or maybe you have a situation where you have two, circuits or two circuits that kind of share a junction box. And sometimes electricians will mistakenly put all of the neutrals for both circuits. They'll just bundle them under one wire nut. And when they do that, they need to be kept separate. Otherwise, now you've created these different paths for energy to get back, and it creates an imbalance of current on the hot wire and the neutral wire for circuits. And when that's the case, you don't get that nice cancellation effect. And so then you can have high magnetic fields radiating off your wiring, and that's a situation that you don't want. So those are kind of, you have pieces of equipment that can be just point sources. That's easy to avoid. You have wiring errors that can be a source of magnetic fields. And then you have like your high tension power lines can be a source. And then the third type of EMF pollution that's related to electricity or use electricity is something called dirty electricity. And I know we're probably going to get into that in more detail later, so I can kind of save most of what I'll say for that later. But basically, dirty electricity is a byproduct of how, or a side effect of how a lot of modern devices use electricity. They can't use it as it's provided to us by the utility company. They have to change and manipulate it. And in that process, they create something known as dirty electricity. And I can explain that a little bit more when we get kind of into the specifics of dirty electricity. And then the fourth type of EMF kind of pollution, artificial, man-made, is what I sometimes call wireless radiation, because that's its main source, but it's actually called radio frequency radiation, RF radiation. Sometimes you'll hear people say RF microwave radiation. And basically it is, kind of associated with everything wireless. So all wireless communication, it's kind of using wireless technology, basically uses electromagnetic energy to send information through the air from one place to another, rather than through a wire or cable or some other kind of like hardwired situation. And so that is wireless radiation. So the sources are obvious. We've got our cell phones, we have cell phone towers, we've got radio broadcast towers, TV broadcast towers, Wi-Fi, wireless internet, all of our smart, apparel and watches, and you name it. I mean, there's so much. And then of course, microwave ovens. Also, they actually use microwave energy to cook food by exciting and heating the water molecules in food. And so you will get leakage from a microwave oven of kind of that radio frequency microwave radiation. So those are basically the four types. So you have your 60 hertz electric and magnetic fields. You have dirty electricity. All three of those are related to our use of electricity. And then you have wireless radiation, which is predominantly related to our use of, all kinds of wireless devices and all the infrastructure that support them.
That was awesome, Kim. Yeah, I appreciate the deep explanation on the hot and the neutral wire. I'd never heard it explained that way, and that was really helpful. I think it'll be helpful for the listeners. One time I was renting a RV years ago, and there was a power line right above my bed because it was parked and I couldn't move it. So as you were speaking about that, it made me kind of reminisce on those times. And that was a time where I was really worried and really concerned with mitigating all different sources of EMFs. And I ended up just buying a Magnetico sleep pad like used. And I just figured kind of creating this bubble around my bed would help protect me. And I did sleep better when I got that. So I don't know if it was placebo or if it was actually helping. It seemed like it was actually helping. But it does seem really hard to mitigate. I mean, I was racking my brain on how I could. I mean, it was literally like probably 10 feet above my bed.
Yeah, and the magnetic fields are tricky because they're hard to shield.
Right.
They're not like some of the other fields where you can shield them or there's easy things to do. It's they have a way of getting through a lot.
Right.
I think one of the things that's really interesting that, if just talking about the different types of EMF is that, I mean, most people don't realize it. I didn't realize it, but it hasn't been that long. It's only been about 125 years ago. I mean, prior to that period of time, prior to the introduction of electricity, basically, the rollout of electricity into homes, the only types of EMF that we were exposed to were those found in nature. And so now, in a relatively short period of time, in terms of our human history, just 125 years, we've completely changed our electromagnetic environment. We have now, not only are we exposed to just those natural forms, some of which, like sunlight, we know we have to be careful not to get too much, but now we're exposed to, levels of this artificial EMF that's literally, I mean, some experts say it's millions to even maybe billions of times higher than what you would just find in the natural kind of ambient atmosphere. And like I said, it all started with just the introduction of electricity into homes. And then it slowly grew from there, because once we had electricity, initially that was to provide light in homes. But of course, then we realized this is great. And so just started developing, lots and lots of different kinds of devices that made life easier that run on electricity. And then, it's been probably in the last, I'd say, since the 1980s, and really accelerating from there with the electronics boom, everything electronic, and then the wireless kind of revolution, or, the introduction of wireless technology, that things have really, really grown exponentially in terms of the amount of EMF that we're surrounded by. I always think it'd be interesting, to be in certain environments. You think, there's certain environments you're in, like an airport or a stadium concert, or just even, all kinds of places where if we could make visible what's invisible. I mean, that's the one thing about this pollution, lots of other kinds of pollutions. We have some, some things that kind of let us know, like, oh, should I be worried about this? Because maybe we can see it, or we can smell it. And you think, oh, is that good for me? Well, this is invisible. And so I always think, gosh, it would be so interesting to be able to make visible, like, all of this energy that's zipping around us now, because it might make us think twice, about being a little careful about our exposures.
Yeah. Do you think the whole Elon Musk Starlink launching these, satellites around the Earth, I've heard people really concerned about that and how that's kind of amplifying the microwave effect on the planet?
Yeah. I mean, I think it definitely is. And, I'm not a fan, because I feel like, we should have a choice. I feel like we should have a choice about whether we want to use a wired solution or a wireless solution. And those choices, can then affect our exposures. But when you start having so much like of that type of thing, it becomes hard to avoid, exposure, because you don't have as much choice, because something's happening that you maybe aren't subscribed to, but it's affecting your environment. And I know that I'm a believer that, there are folks who are particularly sensitive to this energy. And I know there's kind of a lot of, looking into, why are, particular individuals, kind of hypersensitive, but I believe that it's affecting us all. And that I think folks that are particularly sensitive are almost like our canaries in the coal mine, letting us know that maybe this is not so great. Maybe we need to look at, how to provide the same kinds of benefits that we get from technology. I mean, you don't have to be anti-technology, to still be mindful about EMF. I mean, there's ways to get many of the benefits that we get right now in ways that are safer for our health. And so, that's the direction I feel like we should be moving. So I'm not really a fan, of, Wi-Fi or WiMAX networks or satellite, and, like widespread satellite wireless technology that sort of takes that choice away from individuals about, do I want to be using wireless, and all of a sudden they're exposing us all. So I'm not a big fan of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I moved from being fully off grid, where it was only my Wi-Fi signal, and then whenever you live in a population dense area like a city, you're often going to see 5, 10, if you're in an apartment, you'll see like 40 different Wi-Fi, names when you pull it up on your settings on your phone. And yeah, at that point, you really have to get smart with, and some people just don't have a choice, right? With your economic situation or whatever it is. And so I feel like that's where like
Right.
mitigation comes in. I wanted to ask you about measuring though, since we didn't talk about that. Like I got my start, I don't know, 13 years ago with the tri-field meter. And since then I've started to kind of question the validity of that meter. What are your thoughts on that one? Because I see a lot of people use that in YouTube videos. They'll show
Yeah.
the tri-field meter and the thing going off. And
Yeah. I mean, I think measurement's an interesting thing because I think that, just as there are different types of EMF pollution, there are different tools for measuring each type. It's not usually one size fits all, but there are combination meters like the tri-field meter and some others that allow you, by using different settings to measure more than one different type. One of the drawbacks a lot of the combination meters is that, it's hard to get a tool that does everything really, really well, especially at a level that maybe a professional would want if they were going in to do a professional assessment of somebody's home. Now, what's challenging is that, for folks that want to get into measuring, it can be pricey to get, individual meters, to measure each different type. So using something, I feel like something like the tri-field for a consumer level meter can be an okay place to start. It's one of the complaints I think that people have is that it's not sometimes sensitive enough on the low end, meaning it's not able to pick up kind of low level readings that might still be considered of concern, given, say, the building biology standards or guidelines. And so I think that's one of the concerns is like whenever you're looking at a meter, you're kind of looking, okay, what frequency range, what frequency range along the spectrum is it going to cover? And then how sensitive is it? Meaning, how low a reading can it pick up or detect? And is that reading, where does that reading sit with regard to some of the standards that people might be kind of comparing their exposure to? So on the tri-field, I think the best setting is the magnetic field setting. It's a pretty good meter for using, for testing magnetic fields. I think it's a good entry level meter. It's good enough for RF, although again, the sensitivity at the low end is not great, and it's not going to necessarily go up high enough to get, all of the wireless technology that's out there right now. The electric field setting is probably the weakest in terms of the sensitivity on the low end. But for people that can't afford to go out and get a separate meter for, measuring AC electric fields, magnetic fields, and radio frequency fields, it can be a good starting place. And one thing I do say, we get a lot of people say, well, I'm trying to use my tri-field to measure dirty electricity. It's not meant to measure dirty electricity. It's definitely not sensitive enough to measure dirty electricity, and it can't distinguish between kind of those 60 hertz fields and the higher frequency dirty electricity fields. And what's interesting about that, and we may talk about this later, is that the 60 hertz field in most environments is going to be a stronger field in terms of amplitude. It'll be predominant in terms of the reading that you get off of a meter compared to, say, the portion that's dirty electricity. But it's dirty electricity has a very unusual and erratic kind of waveform, whereas 60 hertz signal is a nice kind of smooth sine wave. Dirty electricity is very erratic and sort of more pulsed in nature, kind of similar, in a sense, to a pulsed RF field. And scientists and people that are researching EMF seem to think that the kind of non-sinusoidal, kind of pulsed, more erratic fields may be more problematic and agitating to our bodies. But getting back to it, yeah, the tri-field is, I think, an okay meter for, like a real entry-level meter. If someone wants to start someplace, I think it's good. Just be aware you're not going to be able to measure dirty electricity well with it. You can measure the other three types of EMF pollution, but you may not be able to pick up low-level readings that might be of concern, especially if you're somebody who's electrically hypersensitive, because they can be very sensitive to very low levels.
I like what you said earlier, that the body could be, a meter. And that's been my experience. I think when I first got into these filters, I don't think I bought the measuring one for the first couple weeks or something, and I just plugged them in my bedroom. and I did sleep better. I definitely did. And I think I might have been tracking it at that time. So yeah, I like that point that you could use the body if you can't afford a meter or whatever.
Right. Well, and that's one of the things that people, you mentioned sleep. I think that's one of, and it's not just dirty electricity, EMF, pollution in general. That seems to be one of the, the major kind of effects on sleep and insomnia and sleep disruption. And so lowering your exposures, whether it be to dirty electricity and other things, that's one of the things we hear most is like, oh, I'm sleeping better,
Mm-hmm.
which sleep is so important. It's so important to our health in terms of the important rejuvenative work we do at night. We don't even know we're doing it, but our bodies are just doing it. And if you're not sleeping well, your body's not able to do that important work as well. So
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. If I'm sleep deprived for a couple nights, like I'm wrecked for the next couple days.
yep. I hear you. I can relate to that.
So yeah, let's jump into dirty electricity. You kind of touched on it a little bit, but kind of expand on it and how was it discovered? And
yeah, so like I said, dirty electricity is one of the 4 different types of kind of EMF pollution that have become common now in most homes. It's hard to find a situation where you don't have some dirty electricity. It's also known, sometimes people will hear it. It's kind of good to know the different names because sometimes you'll hear it called different things. Kind of the most popular name, I think, is dirty electricity, but sometimes you'll also hear things like dirty power, noise or electrical noise, line noise, electromagnetic interference or EMI, power line EMI, microsurge electrical pollution, HASH. I mean, there's a lot of different names, but it's all kind of referring to this one thing called dirty electricity, which is essentially, I mean, what it is, it's kind of like these surges and spikes of electromagnetic energy that are traveling for the most part along the wiring, in buildings. I'm going to use homes mostly because that's kind of what we deal with most, but it's buildings. But, travels along the electrical wiring in homes where only kind of clean, conventional 60 hertz electricity should be. But nowadays there's all this kind of like extra spiky energy. And as I mentioned earlier, it's kind of a byproduct of how many modern, pieces of equipment, appliances, and other devices use electricity. And so they can't, the characteristics of the electricity that's provided to us by our utility, there's just certain characteristics. But a lot of our modern machinery can't use that electricity exactly as it comes to us. They have to change or manipulate it in one way or another. So, like, for example, there's, this is particularly true with like energy efficient, light bulbs and energy efficient things. Sometimes, equipment is drawing electricity in little bits or pulses rather than as a nice, smooth, continuous stream. They're also many have to change what's known as the alternating current or AC electricity that's provided by the utility company into what's known as direct current that travels only in one direction. And a lot of devices have to, especially electronic devices, have to lower the voltage that's supplied from 120 volts to much lower voltages to, feed the circuit boards and sensitive kind of electronic equipment. And so it's those types of processes that cause a lot of interruptions in that nice, smooth flow of electrical current. And those interruptions, it's kind of chopping up and distorting that nice, pretty sine wave. And it's creating lots of like surges and spikes of energy. That's their technical names are harmonics and voltage transients. And so once that energy is created by a piece of, equipment as it's running, some of it, a little bit of it will radiate directly off of that equipment kind of as higher frequency electric and magnetic fields. So much higher than the 60 hertz. It's usually up in the kilohertz range, sometimes into the megahertz range. So some of it will radiate directly off the piece of equipment, but most of it actually gets conducted back onto the wiring in your wall, and then it can travel throughout your house. So dirty electricity really enjoys traveling along hot wires. It can, most of it will travel along hot wires. It can move in any direction. So once my computer is generating dirty electricity, it goes, kind of goes back down my power cord, and into my walls. It can travel in either direction. So it can go farther out to other, along the wiring that's going farther out in a circuit, or it can travel back toward, your electrical panel. When it gets to the electrical panel, it can easily then distribute itself amongst other circuits in your house. So you can have the dirty electricity that you're generating, if you're from your equipment inside, won't be contained to just that area. It can kind of travel throughout your house. And then it can even travel, out of your house via the supply lines coming in and into neighbors' houses. So your neighbors can be getting your dirty electricity, and you can be getting their dirty electricity. So that even when we take steps to kind of reduce like dirty electricity sources in our own spaces, we can still be getting dirty electricity that's coming in from our neighbors. And sometimes you can be getting a lot, especially like if you have a neighbor that's got a solar power installation, or high efficiency furnace, or certain things where you can be getting quite a bit of dirty electricity from your neighbors. And so yeah, basically once it's created, dirty electricity spreads, and as it's traveling, flowing along wiring in your walls, it'll also travel up and down any power cord that's plugged into an outlet. It'll travel up and down the power cords. And as it's traveling, it's going to radiate these higher frequency electric and magnetic fields into our environment. And it's mostly, the biggest part is the electric field. And that tends to emit, from about 4 to 6 or more feet off of our wiring and our walls. Wow. There's lots of different sources of dirty electricity. I always think, when you're learning about EMF and the different types, it's really good to start to understand what each is, but also like what are the common sources, in your environment? Because when you come to then mitigating or trying to do something about it, knowing your sources becomes very important. So with dirty electricity, some of the most common sources are like modern lighting solutions is a big one. So your energy efficient light bulbs. So all compact fluorescents tend to create a lot of dirty electricity. Some of your halogen light fixtures, especially low voltage halogen, anything because they have to change the voltage of the electricity, is going to produce dirty electricity. A lot of LEDs, especially older LEDs, will produce as much and sometimes more as a compact fluorescent. There are some LEDs I hear on the market that run at 120 volts, which is the same voltage as supplied by the power company. So if they run at 120 volts, they shouldn't produce dirty electricity. And it seems that some LEDs may have kind of some built-in filtration. So some LEDs are okay and some are not. And we can talk about it later, but there are ways that you can test light bulbs, with a plug-in EMI meter to get a sense of, okay, is this light bulb creating dirty electricity or not? But generally speaking, your incandescent bulbs won't, but a lot of your energy efficient bulbs will. So you have those energy efficient light bulbs, also light dimmer switches. So we love our dimmer switches for creating mood lighting. Unfortunately, especially, the more modern ones, they just produce a lot of dirty electricity. The way that they regulate the lighting level chops up that kind of sine wave of electricity and just produces a ton of dirty electricity. Equipment that has motors, especially variable speed motors, tend to produce a lot of dirty electricity. So a lot of your modern energy efficient HVAC equipment, so your furnaces, your air conditioners, pool pumps, well pumps, refrigerators, power tools, vacuums, anything with a motor, especially if it's got a variable speed motor, is going to produce a lot of dirty electricity. Any of your electronic equipment, and that it's like a huge umbrella, because it feels like today. So of course we have things like, and that's because of the transformer or the switch mode power supply that's used in that equipment. So, your computers, your printers, your gaming systems, your device chargers, all of these things, tend to produce a lot of dirty electricity. And let's see, what I was going to say something about.
What about power strips, Kim? Like I've heard a lot of things over the years about dirty electricity, and one of them is like the more like your computer area is often the worst source because the more things you have plugged in to one outlet, the worse it could be. Is there a truth to that, or?
Well, I think it's true that home offices tend to be, especially your computer area in your house or where you play your games, they tend to be an area high of that produce a lot of dirty electricity because it's a lot of electronic equipment. And a lot of electronic equipment today has got a switch mode power supply versus a linear transformer. And so anything with switch mode power supply is going to generate a lot of dirty electricity. So you're right. We tend to have, lots of stuff plugged into a power strip. I mean, the good part about that is, there's things that you can do to address sources. And then, with filtration, you can kind of help, by plugging in filters close to, those known sources. So, either in the same outlet as a power strip, with a power strip plugged in the top outlet and a filter or two on the bottom outlet. Like you said earlier, you can put filters in a power strip. You can sometimes plug the power strip through a filter, as long as you're not drawing too much current on that power strip. So there's lots of different ways that you can help mitigate the dirty electricity that's being produced by those. But what's amazing to me with the electronic equipment is that it's not just the obvious stuff these days, like our computers and stuff. It seems like so many things that used to be simple devices, have now, like all the bells and whistles, now they have all these digital displays. So our appliances, even if you've got gas appliance or something, it's usually got a digital display screen that's almost like a little computer. Well, all that digital stuff, is going to be generated. It runs on electricity, and it's going to be generating dirty electricity. I went to get like an electric tea kettle recently, and those used to be pretty simple, but now, they're not. Everything is so fancy. Toasters and all these things that used to be a little simpler now are not as simple and tend to produce dirty electricity if they've got, the kind of like the special display, almost computerized way of using them in terms of your options. And so that's the problem, is we've just had so many pieces of equipment these days that have to do those crazy manipulations with electricity, and that's how the dirty electricity gets produced.
Everything's app controlled, right? Like I tried one of those like heating mugs you can buy at, I think it's like Best Buy, and I couldn't do it. I went back to just your regular little, heating thing that you leave your coffee mug on or whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's getting so complicated now, and more stuff to break, more EMFs, right?
Well, yeah, the stuff doesn't last as long because it's all got these, the electronic components tend to wear out more than the old, just like simple heating coils and things used to.
Right. You did mention like solar panel installations earlier, and I kind of wanted to expand on that. And another thing I'd heard over the years about dirty electricity is like something you mentioned, like your neighbors could be getting your dirty electricity and vice versa. So I actually have solar here, and I went from fully off-grid solar to now I'm on-grid solar. Have you looked into the difference between those and just, the connection between solar and inverters and batteries and dirty electricity, and whether it's on-grid or off-grid? And
so solar can get kind of complicated, but most solar installations have two components. You have the panels themselves, the solar panels, which are kind of collecting sunlight, and then they convert that sunlight into low voltage DC electricity, which is direct current. And what has to happen is that then the second component of most solar systems is that then you have to have inverter, either a string inverter or micro inverters that take that low voltage direct current and convert it to basically higher voltage, AC, alternating current electricity to feed the electrical system in your house, to be compatible with your house. And it's that inversion process that is what is responsible for producing dirty electricity. And so with solar installations, I mentioned earlier, there's 4 types of kind of EMF pollution, and it's mostly dirty electricity and RF, the wireless radiation, that are like the EMF kind of sticking points with solar installations. The way that most solar installations are set up, you're not going to get a lot of like 60 hertz electric and magnetic fields, because most of the wiring that's associated with the system is run through metal conduit. And it's kind of, the hot and neutrals are run right next to each other. So you have the magnetic fields canceling out. The metal conduit kind of helps shield the kind of 60 hertz electric field. So you don't have kind of those types of fields, but you do get a lot of dirty electricity from when those, inverters, and the difference, I think I mentioned two terms. I don't want to confuse people. Usually there's two types of systems. You have one type where you have what's called a string inverter, and that's usually just a box that is installed kind of right next to or very close to your main electrical panel. And what happens, it kind of generally speaking, with when you have that type of setup is that, the panels, are collecting the sunlight. They are producing that low voltage DC electricity. All of that low voltage DC electricity is sent via wires down through metal conduit, to that string inverter. And then it's then converted by the string inverter to that AC, kind of 60 hertz AC electricity that is then sent kind of to your breaker panel. The other setup is, now we've got kind of the more modern, where we're moving a little bit more toward, is either micro inverters or kind of this hybrid setup, where some solar systems actually have a little micro inverter that is kind of right underneath every single solar panel. And so in those situations, that DC electricity that's produced by the panel is converted right there by each solar panel into the 60 hertz AC electricity, and then it's sent down through the metal conduit directly to your breaker panel. And the reason why that setup, kind of from a electricity standpoint, production standpoint is better, is that with the microinverters, each solar panel operates independently. So during the course of a day, if you get kind of any shadowing from a tree that might be affecting one or two panels, then if production on those two panels goes down a little bit, it doesn't affect what's happening on the other panels. So, you might be producing at 50% on one panel that's now being shaded by the tree, but say you have 20 panels, the other 19 panels can be producing at 100% if they are, receiving sunlight. Whereas with a string, with a traditional string inverter, if one or two panels is affected, it can affect, by 50%, let's say, it will affect production across the whole array of panels by 50%. So it's just not quite as efficient as having the micro inverters. Or there's also Solar Edge has a setup that has a string inverter, but they have like wires basically that go up to every single solar panel and bring that current down. So it allows for those panels to operate independently, even though you have a string inverter. So, and Solar Edge, and Enphase, which is one of the micro inverters, those two tend to produce less dirty electricity than some of the others. So they're good from that standpoint. But to get back to your question, so we've got, you have a lot of dirty electricity that's produced, by the inverters, and a lot of that dirty electricity then can find its way onto your circuits if you don't do something to kind of help prevent it from distributing itself widely amongst your different branch circuits. And similarly, it can find its way to your neighbor's home, or their dirty electricity from their solar system can find its way to your home. And so that's the one. And then the other piece is, for most systems, especially, a lot of people now do what's known as net metering. So if your solar system is connected to the grid and you don't have your kind of a self-contained system, but you have a connection with the utility company, meaning that any excess power that's produced, it gets basically sold to the electric company. Whenever you have net metering, and there has to be a way for your solar company to keep track. And if you have a lease with your solar company, it's not you that gets the benefit of the excess electricity. You do, in that you're not charged. I mean, it gets complex because contracts can be written by different companies in a lot of different ways. But the basic idea is, if you're leasing your equipment versus owning it, then you're basically whoever your solar company is kind of owns that extra electricity and gets paid for any extra electricity that's difference between what you produce and what actually gets used. But they have to have a way to keep track of what they're producing. And so mostly then they require that you have, and in most cases they require that you have kind of a, wireless, that data, the production data gets sent to the solar company wirelessly. There are some other setups, but most of the companies these days are pushing kind of like it's its own little kind of meter, and it works on the cellular network which is a little different than like how the smart meter mesh networks work. But basically it sends that production data wirelessly, to cell towers, and then it gets relayed, from cell towers to the solar company so that they know exactly how much electricity you're producing. And in some cases, when you have that kind of net metering going on, the utility company will also require you to have an additional like smart meter, so that they can also if they're not sure if they trust a solar company, sometimes they just like to keep track of production data as well. So then you may have, in some cases, some people would have as much as 3 smart meters if they've got a solar system, one that the utility has on there anyway, that's just basically keeping track of usage, like how much, energy do you use. Then they have one that keeps track of how much energy is being produced by the solar panels. And then the solar company has its meter. And so if all of those are operating wirelessly, then you can have quite a bit of wireless radiation that's associated, kind of with your solar installations. So, and then you asked a little bit about so off-grid versus any, solar installation that's got inverters is going to be producing dirty electricity, and that dirty electricity is usually going to be finding its way onto your wiring. There becomes an issue, like some people like to use dirty electricity filters, to help mitigate or help prevent the dirty electricity from propagating and spreading, amongst all their different, electrical circuits in their house. And so there are some cautionary things about using dirty electricity filters with certain, like an off-grid system. And mostly it's, we usually have people check with their solar company, but one of the biggest concerns is that the way dirty electricity filters work, we can get into more detail later if you want, but they have to allow current to flow through them so that they can kind of target the high frequencies that are piggybacking along that 60 hertz, regular clean, the 60 hertz signal. And so they do draw power, but they draw power in a way that when you're connected to the grid, it doesn't affect like your utility bill, because the draw is a kind of a passive electricity draw where the current waveform and the voltage waveform are out of phase. And so the way that energy consumption is calculated, like using filters and that draw, won't affect like how energy consumption is calculated for your bill, but you are allowing energy flow. So if you are on like an off-grid system and you are, either using a battery bank or not using a battery bank, the filters will use some electricity. So you have to keep that in mind, that, it will act as one electrical load on your system. And so if, depending on how much electricity you're able to produce, you just have to keep in mind that the filters are going to use some of that. Because that system operates differently, especially if you're using battery backups. Now, if you are tied to the grid, it shouldn't have an effect, not that effect in terms of if you're tied to the grid, it's not going to matter. If you have a battery bank, the only thing that you might want to make sure, people might want to check with their solar company about is, I think my personal opinion is that when you have a solar installation, the best thing to do is to do filtration right at your panel. So whether it's a whole house filter, you can use plug-in filters to mimic a whole house filter. At least try that first, because it's a lot less expensive to do it that way. And see, lots of people can get some pretty good results that way. But doing filtering right at the panel, reduces the number of filters you need. And then you can spot filter in your home to kind of take care of other dirty electricity being produced. But you may want to check with like your solar provider to make sure that the capacitive filters, most plug-in filters use capacitors to kind of address the dirty electricity frequencies. And you just want to make sure, is there going to be any issue with my battery backup when I'm just on battery backup and just drawing from the battery? Is there any issue with too much capacitance on the line? Would that bother that battery backup system?
Okay. I think you just described what happened to me, because in my fully off-grid house, I fried my computer chip on my oven. It was a $900 like circuit board, and the electricians were turning off and on breakers, and I had tons of dirty electricity filters plugged in the kitchen. And they didn't know why. They couldn't explain it, but they're like, well, your oven's not working now. And so that was a tough lesson. So I ended up just replacing the oven for a non-computerized one, that was just a little battery, simple, old school one. But if you're fully off grid, it's kind of something to be careful of. Like, I think using them.
Yeah, I think especially with too much, it's kind of like the same issue is true with generators. There's generators are primarily an inductive load, and dirty electricity filters are a capacitive load, and there can be incompatibility there if it's too much capacitance. So there's some tipping point. Some filters is probably fine. Too many filters, it's nothing with the filters. It's just that a lot of, especially portable generators, they don't produce very clean energy to begin with. And they don't necessarily play well with a lot of capacitance on the line. It can create like kind of an over voltage situation, which you want to avoid. And so we typically say for people, like, especially with generators, if you're running fully on generator power and you have plug-in dirty electricity filters, no matter what kind they are, it's just like, if you have two, we just don't know, because every house, every system's different. You could have 4 filters plugged in and it could be fine, but you have 12 and it's not fine. But we don't know where that tipping point is. So with generators in particular, we usually say just unplug your filters. If the house is being fully run on generator power, and then it's okay to plug them in, back in when you're back on kind of grid supplied power.
What about this? Kind of an interesting question. Like, now they have like the Ford Lightning, they have like electric vehicles that could actually reverse power, like charge the house. Have you heard of that, where you could use electric vehicles as your generator to power the house? I guess it depends on the car's system, and
it would depend on the car system. And I would sometimes when you ask, you call a manufacturer of that system, you say, oh, are my dirty electricity filters? They may not know, but the real question is, how is the system, would the system be affected by capacitance, on the line? And, because that's a good question, and things change so quickly. It's hard to keep up with all the systems out there. But the issue is like, would that particular, it's really only generators. I think sometimes the solar systems you want to, the biggest thing is it can act as an energy draw. And so if you're relying on all the energy that's stored in batteries, you're just going to be using some of your energy up, because filters are plugged in all the time. They don't draw a lot of power, but they're going to be continuously, drawing power. And so it just means that you're using some of that battery storage. And then the second thing is you do want to check with your manufacturer to see whether capacitance on the line is an issue. And most times that's why I say installing, filters kind of at the panel, or some kind of filtration at the panel, and trying to take care of most of it before it actually distributes yourself on your branch circuits. So you're not just installing a bunch of filters inside, but just taking care of it right away and then just spot filtering. Then in most cases, it should be fine. But, I think checking with the manufacturer about, is too much capacitance an issue? And then, you can talk to us as well.
Great.
But every solar system is different. Every home is different. The age of the wiring, there's so many things that can affect, kind of some of those complicated situations.
Right. Why don't you guys sell a whole house filter here?
We're actually in the process of developing one. And I find, most of the filters on the market these days are capacitor based, whether they're a whole house system or not a whole house system. There is kind of one manufacturer I know that doesn't do capacitive filters. But I sometimes get the term whole house filter, sometimes I feel like can be a little misleading. What they get installed at the panel and what they're really kind of good at doing is addressing dirty electricity that's coming in to your system off of the grid. Like from your neighbors' houses, or, some of those big installations you might have on your own property, like a solar installation, or, some major appliances that might be wired directly to the panel, like a high efficiency furnace. And so having filters right there at the panel kind of helps mitigate the dirty electricity as it's coming to the panel before it distributes itself widely across all your branch circuits. And so, but a whole house system isn't necessarily going to, unless it's inductive, and most aren't, isn't going to take care of the dirty electricity that's being produced inside by all the stuff inside until it kind of travels to the filter. By that time, it's kind of traveled through the wiring and radiated stuff out. And so sometimes, having something at the panel, especially if you have a lot of dirty electricity coming into your electrical system from, external sources outside your house, or these large kind of specialized installations in your house, like solar power. Sometimes you still need to do spot filtering, throughout the house to address what you're generating inside and trying to mitigate it before it's traveling, along too far along wiring, because then, it's as it travels along wiring, it's radiating out those higher frequency electric and magnetic fields.
Okay. Will yours be inductive?
We are looking at all the possibilities.
That's great.
But we're trying to create something that will do a really good job and also be relatively cost effective in comparison. And a lot of people, I think, like I mentioned, a lot of people use plug-in filters at the panel, to kind of mimic a whole house filter with results that are as good and sometimes even better. Mm-hmm. And basically it just involves the way the electricity coming into your house. There's two supply lines that come into your house. They're each bringing 120 volts. And so each supply line comes in, and one supply line feeds some of the circuits in your panel, and the other supply line feeds the other circuits. And there's a few circuits in most homes that are fed by both, things that require 240 volts, like your dryer, sometimes your oven or range. Sometimes like HVAC equipment will run on 240 volts. So there's going to be some circuits that are fed by both. But when you're mitigating at the panel with plug-in filters, what you want to do is make sure that usually what people do, and depending on whether they're inside or outside, depends on whether you do this inside a waterproof box or not, is that if they've got room in their panel for a dedicated circuit, one for each, usually for a lot of, it depends on your setup, but for a lot of homes, there's often already an outlet very close to the electrical panel. But that outlet will be fed by one of the supply lines. So you want to make sure that you've got an outlet or two right near the panel. You want to be as close to the panel as possible. And you want to have at least one or two outlets for each of those hot supply lines coming in. So if you have an electrician figure out, if you already have, one outlet, kind of 1-2 socket outlet that's, right by your panel, an electrician can help to figure out, okay, which supply line is that being fed by? And then looking at your panel to see, let's create a dedicated circuit and an outlet that's on the other, what we call legs, supply legs, so that when you plug in filters in those, two different kind of outlets, and we usually say two filters, sometimes 3 is usually enough, but you want to make sure that you're filtering what's coming in on each of those supply lines. So it requires, an outlet or two associated with each, hot leg coming into the house, and installed as close to the panel as possible. And then you can install dirty electricity filters in there, and that can filter a lot of what's coming in before it, distributes itself widely. And so it can be a cost-effective, way to kind of more cost-effective sometimes than a whole house filter, especially if you want to try it out before investing in a larger system. But we will, at some point, hopefully in the not too distant future, we kind of put some of the development work during the craziness of COVID and all the supply chain issues and freight issues. We had to put some of the development projects on the back burner, just to make sure we could get parts and supply for just our regular product. And so now all those projects are coming off the back burner and getting attention again.
That's great. Well, that's a great tip too, because I think a lot of people, especially when they see the price and, what do you mean I need 20 filters for the size of my house? Where if they just want to get started, they could get, 2, 3, or 4 and just put them strategically right there and get a huge benefit. That's really cool.
Yeah. And we haven't talked about, one thing to talk about, so measuring dirty electricity, this is where sort of having and I would say most people, for the ease, you tend to use a plug-in EMI meter. But there's basically 3 different approaches that you can use for measuring dirty electricity. But one is definitely the most common because it's tends to be the easiest, the most accurate, and the tools that are out there are tools out there, available for doing it. So the most common way is to measure the dirty electricity that's flowing along your wiring. Because, like I said, when dirty electricity is produced, a little bit of it, gets kind of emitted directly off of a piece of equipment, but most of it gets conducted off of the wiring. So most of the kind of what I'll call radiated dirty electricity that's in your environment, those higher frequency electric and magnetic fields, are radiating from the wiring. So most of the dirty electricity that's kind of become ambient in your environment is going to be from the wiring. So measuring kind of at the source is kind of a good baseline for what's probably radiating out. And so, the best and most informative way to measure dirty electricity that's on your wiring is with an oscilloscope. But an oscilloscope for the average consumer, not everybody wants to, they're not that expensive anymore, because you can get software that basically you can use on like a laptop. You do need some cables, and sometimes you need a special antenna and stuff, but it's more that it takes some expertise and training to really learn to use an oscilloscope effectively, and to make sure that you don't fry equipment and things like that in the process of doing it. And but it can provide the most informative kind of real-time information about exactly the nature of the dirty electricity, not just the amplitude, but the specific frequencies that are riding your wiring, and that can give you a sense of sources. And so you can get a lot of information from an oscilloscope. The average consumer doesn't necessarily want to take the time to learn to use an oscilloscope. A lot of professionals do, but even a lot of professionals will also use what's easiest for a consumer is what is known as a plug-in EMI, or dirty electricity meter. Sometimes it's called a microsurge meter, line noise meter, but basically you plug it in to electrical circuits, and it's going to give you a sense of how much dirty electricity is flowing along the wiring, on that part of the circuit. And the nice thing about that type of meter is it's not very expensive, and it's really easy to use, and it's helpful in a lot of ways. So not only can you take dirty electricity readings just to get a sense of, gosh, how much dirty electricity do I have running along my wiring? You can also use it to estimate how much of the dirty electricity I have is kind of coming in from the grid, from the outside, versus how much of it, might be just generated on my own property based on the things I have running. You can use it to identify internal sources of dirty electricity. You can use it obviously to see the difference that, filters or other mitigation strategies, reduction strategies, what difference are they making? So you can see before and after readings. And then it's also just a great tool if you are going to use filters, just to guide the installation to get optimal results. So it can help you figure out what's the best number of filters to have in a particular room, which combination of electrical outlets, because you don't need filters in every outlet. You don't want filters in every outlet, that you usually don't need them either. But the meter can kind of help you fine tune which combination of outlets gets you the best results. And then you can also help you troubleshoot some problems that can occasionally come up during installation, like resonance, where you might get an increased reading rather than a decreased reading, and troubleshooting that. But getting back to, I start talking about measurement because when we're talking about installing at the panel, it's particularly important to install the panel if you do have a lot of dirty electricity coming in off of the grid. And so there is a way to use the meter basically to kind of get a sense of how much is coming in. And it usually involves, just kind of identifying two circuits in your home. It's usually good to have one on each hot leg coming in that you can isolate, meaning that you could turn everything else off, all your other circuit breakers you turn off, and then you would leave just two on, one that's on hot leg A, or one fed by hot leg A, one fed by supply line or hot leg B. And then you try and make sure that nothing is running inside on either of those circuits. So that's why you want to pick two circuits where it's easy to do that, where it's easy to unplug stuff, turn stuff off, where you would have nothing running on the circuit. And then if you take readings on those two, circuits that you've left on, and you have nothing inside running on them, then any dirty electricity that you're reading is probably coming from external sources. So, in off of the grid. And if those readings are high, then it's particularly important, to consider installing either plug-in filters or, a larger whole house system right there at the panel to try and address all that before it comes inside your house. And then when you do that, then you end up needing less, if you're using plug-in filters, then, or even a whole house, then you end up needing less filters inside. If you're taking care of what's coming in from the outside at the panel, and then you just spot filter inside, especially close to any known sources. You want to always install your filters as close to sources of dirty electricity as possible.
That's awesome. Yeah, you guys provide a lot of information. Like I recently, since I moved, I ordered a bunch of Greenwave filters, and I love the write-ups that you guys include with the order because it's so helpful. You have the whole FAQ, like you mentioned, resonance, if you had an increased reading rather than decreased reading. Like it's all laid out there in that little packet. It's really great.
Oh, good. That's good.
So with the EMI meter, what's considered high, and does that differ for different people? If someone's more electrosensitive, like I've heard anything over 50 is high, and people throw out numbers like.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, like when we give guidance to folks when they're measuring, I mean, the goal, if you can, is if you can get, so our particular EMI meter reads in millivolts. And so the target is to try to get below 50 millivolts if you can. Now that's not, and obviously, ideally, the lower you can get the readings, the better. But that doesn't mean continuing to just plug in filters and try, you know what I mean? There's kind of like, that's why it's helpful to have a meter. There's kind of a balancing point. You want to make sure that every time you're installing an additional filter that you're getting at least a 20%, roughly a 20% change. Otherwise, it's not really worth it. And sometimes as if you're installing in a home, usually I tell people the first step is I believe that it's really important to have a meter to guide installation. So I always say do your measurements first, try and get a sense what's coming in from the outside, try and get a sense of, all your measurements inside. And are there particular areas of the house where your readings are higher than other rooms? And then try to, especially in those areas where the readings are high, try and use the meter to get a sense of, well, what might the sources be in this room? And it's fun to kind of play with it. And some people like to do it with their kids because it ends up being like a little bit of a science experiment, but it's sort of fun, to see okay, I'm going to leave my meter plugged in, and then I'm going to turn things on and off in a room to see what might be causing that high reading. And, when you turn a certain thing off, if the reading goes way down, but you're like, okay, well, that's generating a fair amount of dirty electricity, on this particular circuit. And the reason why that can be important is that having all this information, understanding a little bit about how much is coming from the outside, which rooms in my home are really high, what are some of the sources maybe in those rooms? All of that information really helps you fine tune your installation of filters. So rather than just randomly plugging things in, you can be, really efficient, with your installation so that you're not installing more filters than you actually need, that you are, some of your sources. So you're installing as close to those sources as possible so that you're mitigating, that dirty electricity, soon after it's created. So it doesn't have a lot of time to spread far and wide, on your circuits. And you're figuring out what's your best combination of outlets and things like that. And so all that information you collect through measurement can really help to kind of fine tune that installation.
That's awesome. Let's see. I'm looking through the Q&A questions here to see if we have any good ones. Does it increase magnetic field? Someone asked. Is that?
So yeah, and this is a question that comes up a lot. And so there's two things to understand is, one, lots of different pieces of, there's many things, and this is fun to play. If you have, you read, so magnetic fields, 60 hertz magnetic fields or other magnetic fields are usually read with a Gauss meter. And so it's kind of fun to have a Gauss meter, just to see what different equipment, what kind of magnetic field they give off. It can be handy. For example, I was just I did this for a friend, but I was taking some magnetic field readings at her house because she was concerned. And we found that her dishwasher, was under counter. You can't see any electronics on it, but it does have electronic components that are kind of in the display screen when you pull it out. Well, it was giving off a high magnetic field right there by the counter, right where you would, if you stood right in front of it, it was giving off a really high magnetic field, even when it wasn't running, because it just had like anything, is sometimes things have a clock that's running on your microwave oven when it's not actually on, but it had components that were kind of running even when the dishwasher was not on. And so I said, well, this is a great example of how knowing that this field is here, you can say, okay, well, rather than stand right there, and that was where she happened to stand to do like a lot of her chopping and food prep. So I said, if you shifted over, and I could show her with a meter, like, look, if we shift over just like a foot to a foot and a half, you're out of that field. It's just a small change like that. And she still had counter space. And so it's a perfect resolution. And so similar with like a filter is just like a lot of different equipment, that anything that's got electronic components, which is a lot of what we have these days, is going to give off a little bit of a what we call localized or point source magnetic field when it's plugged in and running. And so a filter is no different. Now, the strength of that field, is going to vary for different pieces of equipment. For a dirty electricity filter, generally speaking, if you have a Gauss meter and you hold it close up to a filter, the reading might seem, high. Maybe it's like 15 milligauss. But as you move away, usually within 3 to 6 inches, sometimes a little bit more, but usually 3 to 6 inches, you're back down to whatever the ambient levels were in your house. So with filters, that particular point source magnetic field tends to drop off very quickly. The other area of concern, for any capacitive plug-in filter. So this is, any of your capacitive plug-in filters, whether it's Greenwave, there's, other brands, Stetzerizer. Like we talked about before, while they don't draw power in a way that affects power consumption, or your bill, they are allowing current flow. So they do act as kind of a continuous load on your electrical system. It's a passive load. So it's not, it's not a big load, but it is a little bit of a load because there has to be current draw. It has to allow current to flow through it. So it lets the 60 hertz, kind of like 60 hertz signal flow right through, and it's looking for those higher frequencies, usually in the kilohertz range up into the megahertz, the beginning of the megahertz range. And so in situations, if you have any kinds of wiring errors in a home, wiring errors are their own problem. Those don't have anything to do with filters in the sense that filters not going to cause the wiring error. But if you have wiring errors like those that we talked about earlier that are causing like net current on a circuit, usually if you have wiring errors, it's going to affect at least 2 circuits and sometimes more. If you have net current, so you already have basically net current anytime. So if you have any wiring errors, it means that anytime you have something running on that circuit, so when you have electrical current running through the circuit, then you're going to have an elevated magnetic field that you wouldn't expect that would radiate off the wiring. Because normally those magnetic fields come, that are associated with our use of current flow, if everything's wired properly. We talked about a little bit earlier, the amount of electricity on the hot wire is going to equal the amount of electricity on the neutral wire. The magnetic field coming off each of those wires is kind of traveling in opposite directions, so it pretty much cancels each other out. If you have a situation, whether it's a neutral to ground, neutral to neutral, some kind of wiring misconfiguration somewhere in a circuit that's affecting that circuit and probably another circuit, you may have what's the net current on that circuit, meaning all of a sudden what's on the hot wire is not equal to what's on the neutral wire, usually because all of a sudden there's more than one way for that electricity to get back from the piece of equipment to your panel, rather than the neutral wire that it's supposed to be on. And so in a case like that, anytime you have something running on that circuit, whether it be a lamp, a computer, anything, that's when it's running, you're going to get an elevated magnetic field. So because filters run kind of all the time, they're not drawing a lot of current like some other things would, but they were drawing some current. It means that you will have, if you're on a circuit where there's that kind of wiring error, it means that you could have an elevated magnetic field, when all the time. So that is one thing. But I always caution people, I'm like, if you've got wiring errors, you have an issue that really, if it's in a part of the house where you do spend, time, then it's something that should be attended to. Sometimes if people find a wiring error and it's in a part of the house or in a room, a guest room that they hardly ever use, they'll just turn that circuit off and they'll just say, I'm not going to use that circuit. Mm-hmm. But if it's in a part of the house that you use, then, you want to get your wiring errors, kind of work with an EMF professional and an electrician. Sometimes electricians just on their own won't necessarily know what you're talking about, but if they work with an EMF professional, you can kind of track down the source, the improper connection, and get that fixed so that you don't have elevated magnetic fields when you have things running, whether it be a filter, a lamp, an air filter, whatever you would have running on that circuit. Does that make sense? I know that all a little bit complex.
No, that's an awesome explanation. Yeah. And this is go ahead.
And I should say, so the way that the capacitive filter works is it's looking for those high frequencies and high frequency voltage transients, because that tends to be the problematic part of dirty electricity. It's looking for those high frequency voltage transients and spikes and surges. It's shorting them out, and it's shunting them as a reactive current on the neutral back to source. That's why you want to install them as close to source as possible. So it can be putting a little bit of its own current onto the neutral, which can create a little bit of a magnetic field, but that on its own is usually relatively small. It's when there's wiring errors that already exist, when you just don't want to exacerbate or aggravate a problem that already exists, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. And does dirty electricity act I know we were talking, I think, before the recording about voltage-gated calcium channels. Is it kind of the same effect that dirty electricity has on human health, to where it's causing that oxidative stress by calcium flooding into the cell?
Yeah. So EMF research is interesting. So the amount of research that's specifically about dirty electricity is smaller. It's getting harder and harder to get research dollars, for EMF research, and that's a whole different topic. A lot of the research, of late has focused on the kind of wireless boom, because things happen so quickly there. But what we know is that, or what's suspected is that, all types of EMF, whether it be your 60 hertz fields, your dirty electricity, wireless radiation, that RF radiation, it all seems to be bioactive, meaning, it can have effects, within our bodies at a physiological and biological level. So down to the cellular level. And there can be a number of different kind of biological effects that then have cascading effects that can lead to kind of adverse health outcomes, some of which are just kind of more immediate symptoms like headaches or dizziness or brain fog or kind of tingling sensations or difficulty sleeping, those kinds of things. And then you extrapolate from there, and there's certain disease states. So cancers, certain heart arrhythmias, heart conditions, a lot of neurological stuff, looks like connections to Alzheimer's, to ALS, just a whole range of pretty serious stuff. Now, the research is not kind of necessarily far enough along to pinpoint exactly, what each frequency, the exact effect that each, frequency, whether it's a dirty electricity frequency, a wireless frequency, the 60 hertz frequencies, exactly, how do the effects differ on the body? What seems to be known at this point is there's enough information to say there are biological effects happening with all of these. None of them are great. And, it makes sense to look at how to mitigate our environment. But it is, when you start looking at it, it's pretty interesting to look at. You kind of work backwards. You look at some of these health effects, the cancers, or I have my whole list. There's just it could faster heartbeat, slower heartbeat, arrhythmias, all those kinds of things, tremors, dizziness, tinnitus, all these types of things. And then you start, what scientists really want to know, or what they're kind of looking at, is well, what are the mechanisms? What are the changes that are actually happening in the body that might lead to kind of some of these shorter term symptoms, and then over time to these longer term symptoms. And so some of the biological effects, and again, it's hard at this point to pinpoint to specifically dirty electricity versus the 60 hertz field, but we know that these kinds of things are happening in the body. So one big one, DNA damage. So it's been shown through, laboratory research that, exposures, and some of these studies have been on kind of like the, cell phones kind of radiation, but they can lead to, DNA damage. So you can have single and double strand breaks and an increase of micronuclei in the body. Micronuclei, which are little fragments of DNA, is kind of like one huge kind of like early indicator or, association with cancer. And so, in fact, so much so that one of the tests that, is one of the blood tests that's done, for people to see whether they might have cancer is to see, whether there's a presence of micronuclei in the blood. And so we've seen that EMF can cause like an increase in micronuclei. It can cause an increase in double and single strand breaks. Now, our bodies, I found it really interesting when I was learning about all this, that when our cells replicate, mistakes are always made. Sometimes thousands, each time a cell replicates. And our bodies have a pretty good ability to correct or to fix, breaks before they end up in kind of lasting mutations that then get replicated again, in new cells. But our bodies have a limit. And so those kinds of cell, damage was happening, all the time, always, and our bodies could fix it. But now we're bombarded with so much more in an environment, whether it's EMF or chemicals, that our body has a limit to how much it can fix. And if those strand breaks don't get fixed, then they end up, leading to mutations that are lasting. And mutations is also, those are close association, especially with cancer. As well as some other diseases. It's also been shown that the exposure to EMF pollution can cause the cellular stress response. So our cells are kind of set up to recognize things that may be bad for it, and then they launch kind of a response. And in the short term, that response is good because it's kind of the way that a cell protects itself and also learns a little bit about okay, I know that that's not good. And it learns okay, if I recognize that again, I know what to do. But the problem is, what research is showing is that when you have the cellular stress response is happening over, almost continuously, because we have so much continuous exposure, that it starts to break down our body's actual response. It sort of weakens. And then the cellular response over time for cells becomes less because it's having to do it so often that over time it just kind of, erodes the ability of the cell to protect itself. And then it leaves us vulnerable to, for disease or other kinds of illnesses. Then, as you mentioned, one of the big, Martin Paul has done a lot of really interesting work about how different EMFs activate those voltage gated calcium channels. And those channels, are responsible for kind of letting, important things into the cell that the cell needs, and then getting rid of, toxins and stuff, waste that needs to be, go through the waste system and excreted from the body. Well, when it seems that, those are not supposed to open necessarily at all the right, lots of intervals. And so EMF seems to trigger or can trigger those voltage gated calcium channels to open, which then floods the cells with too much calcium. And then that can lead to excessive calcium signal, or it can lead to the, production of a lot of free radicals, reactive oxygen species in the body, which can then lead to oxidative stress and inflammation. And both of those conditions in the body have been associated with a lot of different disease states. So that seemed to be one of the possible, mechanisms. And you have stuff like effects on the blood-brain barrier. There's our brains are kind of protected for the most part from particles that are in our bloodstream, from getting into our brain, because our blood is it's carrying stuff that shouldn't be in the brain. It can be carrying toxins. It can be carrying, stuff through the body to be, taken out and dealt with. And so when that blood-brain barrier breaks down and allows passage of materials from the blood to the brain, then you can start having problems. And it's shown that EMF seems to cause breaches in that blood-brain barrier and allows things in our bloodstream to get into the brain. Mm. And then, let's see, I'm trying to think. Melatonin production is another big one. It seems to, EMF tends to affect melatonin production in reducing melatonin production. And melatonin is an important hormone in regulating our sleep cycles, or helping to kind of initiate sleep cycles, but it's also a really powerful antioxidant. in the body. And so less melatonin seems to, seems to be one of the reasons you get a lot of complaints about sleep, but also, it helps, to prevent cancer and a number of other illnesses. So some of these are just some examples of some of these things that can be happening down at the kind of physiological, biological levels in our bodies that can then, kind of cascade and lead to the longer term effects. I don't think research is at the point where it can, be so specific about this particular frequency is going to do this and this particular frequency will do this under this circumstances. And it's hard in research because our daily living, is, different than what you can create in a research lab. And, in terms of in our daily life, we're created to multiple types of EMF, all at once. We're, exposed to chemicals, we're exposed to so much. And in a laboratory environment, they're usually like focusing on one particular signal. So just looking at the synergistic effects, of all of that EMF as well as chemicals, it's just hard to, it'll take time to continue to build, the research body, but already, all the people that study this say there is already so much information and research to suggest that our exposure standards, our government exposure standards need to change to be more productive. Industry, needs to be pressured to create devices that are safer and with lower emissions. That we should be as individuals right now probably operating, under the precautionary principle, which is, while, all of the cause and effect relationships still kind of there's room to more fully establish those, that we should be taking steps to kind of, lower our exposures where we can.
Yeah, it's like the exposure standards are too high and the RDAs are too low, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I've been looking into mitigation via supplementation, like specifically magnesium, which is calcium channel blocker, natural ascorbic acid, vitamin E. And I've tried all sorts of different things over the years. Up in Idaho, I actually built a Faraday room with the Y-Shield paint, like a dual coat. And it actually gave me anxiety being in that room. So now I question that blocking, especially making a whole room insulated.
Yeah. Well, and I think,
right?
I know people have had success with fully shielded rooms like that, but it also, I really tell people if you're going to experiment with shielding, work with, really learn what you're doing or work with a professional who's done it a lot and can make sure it's installed properly, grounded properly, all of those things. Because sometimes with shielding, I've seen people make their situations worse rather than better. And especially with the paint, if it's not applied, if you have even little places where stuff can get in, once you have signals, people don't realize they put all this up and they're like, I'm gonna use my cell phone in here. Well, then you're now you're in a space where your signals are just bouncing around and hitting you multiple times.
Yeah. This one was grounded, and I was kind of working with the painters, but the reason I know it works is I did bring someone brought a cell phone in, and they didn't put it in airplane mode, and within seconds I felt like a shooting pain in my leg. It was interesting.
Yeah.
But what are your thoughts on grounding or earthing? Clint Ober's been making the rounds for years, and also there's conductive shoes. And what are your thoughts on that whole subject of grounding? Is it situational?
Well, I mean, I'm an advocate in general of earthing or grounding. I mean, I think being in contact with the earth is, can be healthy. I mean, can put us into contact with those kind of healthy, oh my gosh, electrons. The negative, sorry, the kind of the healthier electrons from Earth's surface, have been shown to have some positive effects. Generally speaking, I'm kind of most an advocate for natural forms of grounding, take your shoes off, go walk in the sand, go walk in the dirt, sit in the grass, stand, on earth, barefoot, even if there's 20 minutes, 30 minutes a day somehow. I just feel like that connection with the earth that's real and pure and in nature is my personal favorite way to ground. I know that lots of people use, earthing mats that they either plug into an outlet, a ground port in their home, or, to a ground outside. And I think that, I think it's a little bit situational. I think that people have seen a lot of benefits from using those devices, and have had a lot of positive health benefits. I think the only concern I have, especially, if you're, my preferred way of grounding, like with a mat, would be to ground if you can find clean ground outside and actually connect to the earth outside, as opposed to connecting to the ground pin in an electrical outlet. I think that's preferable. Sometimes the ground in a lot of homes these days, there can be a little bit of current flowing along them, and there can be some dirty electricity and other things like on ground wire. And so I just have questions. I know it's kind of I think I know what Clint says about it, and says that he doesn't think it's a problem. I just question, like, could it be a problem? So it's just one of the like cautionary tales. And I know that a lot of the building biology community, sees the real benefits in earthing and grounding. But for electrically hypersensitive people, they've seen some people that have had adverse reactions, to grounding mats, especially when they're plugged into the ground pin in a home. And so sometimes what they'll say, especially for that population of people, is, you may want to make an effort, if especially like say you're grounding at night, like you have the ground mat under your bed, or you have like a grounding mat in your, you sit on one, where you work on your computer, or you have your feet on one, where you work at your computer. It's like, make an effort to reduce the electric fields in your environment, so that you're not providing an easy way for those AC electric fields, maybe, for you to act as a conduit for those to get to ground, which is kind of where they want to get. And so, I kind of would make that recommendation to everybody. I think, a lot of building biologists say, especially for people that are electrically hypersensitive, that it can make sense to do some reducing of the electric fields in your environment, so you minimize like that possibility of you being a conduit of that energy to ground. And generally speaking, I think that earthing and grounding, people have seen a lot of benefits.
Have you seen people experience or have a different experience plugging in, if they're using the outlet with the grounding sheet, into like a Greenwave filter versus direct in the wall? Because I know you mentioned the electric fields, but the dirty electricity is kind of a big one, right? That can really change.
And that's the thing, is like, so like most dirty electricity filters, they don't filter what's on the ground. They filter mostly, because most dirty electricity is, for the most part, like the bulk of it is like going to travel along the hot wire. You can get some along the neutral, you can get some along, along the ground. But some of the dirty electricity that you find on the ground, some of it can be leakage, from certain equipment. Some of it can be, from improper neutral to ground connection somewhere in the house, where you're getting a little bit of dirty electricity that ends up on the ground because you have an improper connection there. Some of it can be coming, you've got connections between water pipes and ground wires in house. If you've got current coming into your home on water pipes, which is another issue that can cause elevated magnetic fields in homes, either coming in on water pipes, because a lot of our houses are connected. There's certain ways our houses are connected to the neighbors. One of those ways is through like the main water supply pipes, which in many areas are still metal pipes, and metal pipes are conductive. So if current is looking for its way back, to the utility, it's going to take any and all paths. Now, you hope that most of it's going to take the intended path, that neutral, supply neutral back, but the way our system is set up, a lot of energy goes back through the ground. And so it can then travel along water pipes. Sometimes it'll come into the house and try and find its way back out through the supply neutral. And so sometimes that's how you can get some of that energy onto your ground, the grounding wires in your house. And so that's why I'm always a little hesitant to plug in through there, whether it's through a filter or whether it's through, I think in that case, I would not plug through a filter necessarily, because you're not getting a filtering benefit necessarily on the ground. The filters, all plug-in filters that I know are mostly just, they're filtering what's on the hot, because that's where the bulk of the dirty electricity is riding. But when we're talking about grounding, even small amounts, may be an issue for some folks.
Yeah, I appreciate that insight. That's something I've been thinking about for years. I know a while back, I heard someone talking about camping with a grounding sheet, and that's the best way to do it is to put the ground rod like in a river near your tent, and just ground direct to the water. I
Yeah.
still I still haven't tried that, but I'm looking forward to doing that some days.
Yeah, and then just like walk around barefoot in your campsite.
Right, right. Be
You're just
grounded
ground all the time.
24/7. Right, right.
Well, I think it's interesting because, like, I don't know about other people, but I always pay attention. There's certain places where I just always feel really good, and it tends to be those places in nature where there's like a good dose of negative electrons, which are what's best for our body. And so, like, by waterfalls or the ocean or just places, certain places, like you just notice, wow, I feel really good here. Is it just being out in nature? But there's actually something to it. You're getting this beneficial connection with the right kinds of electrons from the earth. So it can be, I think it has definite health effects. I just think, especially for sensitive folks, you may want to address the AC, those artificial AC electric fields that are ambient in your air, radiating off your wiring, before you, before you use those earthing mats. A lot of people who are, and one way to do that, you probably are familiar with this, but a lot of people who are electrically hypersensitive or who are really wanting to like create a sleep sanctuary will turn off the electrical circuits that affect their sleeping area at night. So oftentimes that's the bedroom circuits, but can also be like adjacent rooms. So there's a whole process you can go through to figure out which circuits most affect your sleeping area, then figuring out which of those you can turn off at night because they don't power anything essential like a refrigerator or something like that. And then turning those circuits off at night, either manually, or there are some pretty cool like remote cutoff switches or kill switches that you can have installed where you can easily, with the flip of a switch or a click of a little remote control, like turn off a group of circuits all at once and then easily turn them back on if you need them in the middle of the night for some reason. But when you do that, when you turn off your electrical circuits at night, it means that you will have, that basically shuts off the hot wire. And any, all of the voltage that is applied to that hot wire will not be there. So that means you'll have no 60 hertz electric fields radiating off of that wire, and you won't have any of the dirty electricity, kind of like higher frequency electric fields. So it can create a sleep environment that's much more conducive to sound sleep. And if you're using an earthing mat, then there's less kind of ambient AC electric energy that might be tempted to use you as a path to ground.
Mm. Yeah, it's a great tip. I think I've heard that it could wear out the breakers if you're shutting it off at the breaker every night.
Mm-hmm.
So you might have to beef those up or something.
Yeah, well, I think just for convenience sake, we did this. That was one of the things that we did when we moved here to Colorado is we went through that whole process to figure out which circuits. And then we ended up getting the device that Safe Living Technologies, they're based in Canada, has that allowed us to turn off like a group of circuits. There was, we had 4 different circuits that we wanted to turn off at night. And so we just had these things installed, and it was super convenient because that you don't have to actually flip the breakers, so you don't wear them out. And, depending on the environment you live in, it's much more likely that I'm going to turn off those circuits at night when I can do it with a click of a switch or a switch on the wall than if I have to walk out and put on my boots and walk out in the snow. So there's easy ways to do it. You can work with an electrician to get that all set up, and it can be really helpful for sleep, especially for folks that are, that are particularly sensitive.
Awesome. Well, Kim, thanks so much. You're super knowledgeable, and I learned a lot. And the website's greenwavefilters.com, and you could buy individual filters or up to a 5-bedroom kit, and both 3 or 2-prong too, right?
Yep. Absolutely.
Great. And then the meter's on there as well, which I highly recommend. It's kind of fun. And I love that it shows the percent reduction. I've tried other EMI meters from other brands, and just seeing that percentage reduction is super helpful. It's just an instant. It's much quicker to go around the house and
just to get a quick sense. Yeah. And
Yeah.
we always tell people, and I know this is a building biology perspective, it is my belief that no matter what type of EMF you're talking about, that a strategy for reducing or mitigation is usually going to be multi-pronged. It's not like kind of like always just a quick fix. And even with dirty electricity does have the advantage that it can be filtered. But I always recommend to people, like, understand your dirty electricity environment and what your sources are. And the best type of approach for any type of EMF pollution is to see first what you can do about sources. See which sources you can get rid of or eliminate, which ones you can replace with things that, don't create that type of EMF. Let's say dirty electricity, for example, replacing light dimmer switches with regular on-off switches. There's creative ways that you can still create different levels of lighting with regular, different circuits, with different levels, different watt bulbs, and turn some on, turn others off, but kind of tackling the sources and trying to get rid of the sources and being mindful of how much time you spend, using these devices. Turn them off when you're not using them and unplugging them. Things that, kind of tackling the sources and then using filtration to help take care of what you can't do well by tackling those sources and also what's coming in from, because even in a lot of homes, even if you did everything you possibly could, to lower your dirty electricity, you still may have, either a little or a lot of dirty electricity coming in from your neighbors. So that's where filtration can come in handy. But I always like to tell people, try and be mindful about your sources and then use filtration as kind of a supplemental, helpful thing.
Yeah, I love that you talked about lighting earlier, because that's one of my passions. And when we moved here, it was like CFL, compact fluorescent lighting. So you get the double whammy of mercury and EMFs.
Mercury, EMFs, really bad light. Like triple whammy.
Yeah, we've been playing with the Edison lights, but they're more on grid. They take a ton of power. It's like 60 watts per bulb or something. But they have a really nice glow, and the flicker seems to be a lot lower than other lights.
I know you're trying to wrap up. I did mention earlier, and since we're talking about lighting, especially with LEDs, because the quality of LED lighting is getting a little bit better, and there are some LEDs that don't produce a lot of dirty electricity. So there's kind of a fun little, like if you've got an EMI meter, a plug-in meter, I have a power strip. I use a non-surge protective power strip for this, just a regular old power strip. And you can either do it, by having a little lamp with you, or there's at Home Depot, you can get this nifty little adapter. Basically, it's got a two-prong plug on the bottom, and then it just has an Edison screw right there on the top. And so you can plug it into, your power strip. I'll plug it into the far end of my power strip, the end that's away from the cord side. I'll plug the little adapter thing in there. Then I plug my meter into one of the, outlets that's closer to the cord, and then I'll just screw different light bulbs into that socket, and I'll see how it affects the dirty electricity reading. And so with your LEDs, that's a great way to see if you can find an LED, a brand of LED and a particular model of LED that's not producing as much dirty electricity, because then you get the energy savings, without the dirty electricity. Any of your incandescent lights, like the old traditional tungsten filament, incandescent lights won't produce any dirty electricity, but they do consume a lot of electricity. There is kind of a halogen. They use kind of a halogen rather than the tungsten filament, so it's a halogen replacement incandescent light. Those will not produce any dirty electricity, and you can test those. And those save some electricity, about 28 or 30%. So not as great as a CFL or a LED. I haven't found any CFLs that don't produce dirty electricity. And like I said, LEDs are a mix, but you can test your light bulbs, if you want to be certain, buy a couple brands or a couple samples and see if you can find one that doesn't produce dirty electricity, and then you go from there. But that's where the meter can come in kind of handy, not just to read dirty electricity, but to test and identify sources.
That's a great science experiment. I love it.
It's fun. All these things are fun. I've had quite a few people tell me, "Oh, we did it with my kids, and it was so fun." Like we made it a big science thing around the house. You're taking readings and then experimenting with what made the readings go up, what made the readings go down, all kinds of stuff. And so, it's like
that's awesome.
Yeah,
that's great. We're putting up a greenhouse the next few days. It's finally being done, like a geodesic dome, and so I'll have electricity in there. I'm really curious to take a reading because it's kind of away from the house, but I'm curious what it'll show.
Yeah. Interesting. That'll be interesting.
Yeah, it'll be fun. But thanks so much, Kim. This was great.
Thank you, Matthew. It was. I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Well, stick around as we close out the show.
Okay.
This is definitely a show that I'm going to have to go back and re-listen to. She said so many interesting things, and it was really cool to hear her perspective on grounding. And I liked hearing that she is more of a fan of going rod to earth versus right into the third prong on an outlet. I've done that, and I've felt a benefit, especially if it's not in a high EMF environment with a ton of electric fields or intense electric fields. But the best is definitely to go out the window with that grounding rod. So if you want to check out Greenwave, you can find them at greenwavefilters.com. And if you purchase it through my site, then I get a little commission and it helps support the show and my work. So I appreciate that. And that is at matt-blackburn.com. And you'll see it under Dirty Electricity Filters. I love how informative their website is. I've bought other dirty electricity filters in the past, and there's not nearly as much information as they provide on their website. And better yet, even when you get it in the mail, there's a huge printout to help you strategize your placement of the filters throughout the home. These Greenwave filters are part of my core strategy to protect against the deleterious effects of EMF. I combine them with the Blue Shield scalar products. There have been animal studies on those, and they are efficacious. And that's the Cube C1 that you see on the website there. That's the one that I use here in the home. If you want to go all out, you can look into the Magnetico sleep pad. We sleep on a 20 Gauss magnetic pad, a unipolar unidirectional field. That's really powerful. And also supplementation, ascorbic acid, vitamin E as mixed tocopherols, and magnesium. There are other supplements that help with EMFs, namely zinc. But if I just had to name three, because people like lists of three, vitamin C, vitamin E, and magnesium are a really powerful combo to protect against the various different effects that EMFs has on our biology. So on that website, matt-blackburn.com, you could also see the CLF protocol, all the rest of my recommended products. My brand is Mitolife. You can find that at mitolife.co. I've been building this for the last couple of years with a really small team, no advertising, just a lot of information that I've been putting out there for years. And it's culminated into a nutritional supplement line. All of these vitamins, mineral, animal products, and enzymes have absolutely changed my health. And I've used them to recover from decades of eating basically slop, food deficient in enzymes, food deficient in vitamins and minerals. Sourcing your food the best that you can, combined with supplementation with the right supplements, can make a world of difference in how you perform physically, mentally, emotionally. You can try this experiment. Go supplement free for a couple days, a week, a month, however long you could last, and then add them back in and see if you could feel the difference. Sometimes when we're taking a supplement, the effects are so subtle that we don't think it's doing anything. But as soon as we stop taking it, that's when we feel the difference. Check out the Mitolife Academy as well. That's on YouTube. I put out 2 private videos a month, and then the last day of every month, I do a live Q&A where you can ask me anything. So that's it. I'll see you guys next Friday. Stay supercharged.